Hey, folks, welcome to another episode of Cutter One. I am your host, Jay, just Jay, your resident troublemaker and your resident culture warrior. I hope you are all doing awesome on this midweek day, the hump day, Wednesday. Um, yeah, as we sort of crest the hill, and now it's sort of we coast on into the weekend, right? Let's hope that's how it goes, and it's good for everybody. All right, so at this point in the day, um. I figured I'd save this one for the last because it's more of like a trip down memory lane, right? And we all like a trip down memory lane. I don't know why I'm talking like this, but we all like taking a trip down memory lane. So this article is coming to us from MovieWeb, and it says The Fellowship of the Ring, revisiting the first chapter of Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings. There has been a lot of new Middle-earth content since The Fellowship of the Ring was released. Here's how the first Lord of the Rings movie holds up. And this is published by Kyle Kruska. Okay, I believe we talked about one of his articles before. We didn't necessarily agree with it. So let's see what he has to say this time around. The Lord of the Rings trilogy of films, directed by Peter Jackson, is widely considered to be one of the best trilogies ever put on screen. The films attempted the impossible, as the story written by J.R.R. Tolkien was previously considered to be unfilmable, as it was too sprawling and grand for any movie to be able to do it justice. While there had been several attempts to adapt The Lord of the Rings before, chiefly Ralph Bakshi's animated film from the 1970s, nothing had been as ambitious as the three live-action films Jackson delivered. With Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens co-writing the scripts to the trilogy alongside Jackson, The Lord of the Rings was a massive gamble, as all three movies would be shot back-to-back and released in subsequent years. New Line Cinema sunk just over $280 million into the production of the three films, having agreed to do so before the first entry in the series was even released. It's interesting that they mentioned the $280 million because Rings of Power spent 3 times that and got crap in return, but I digress. Luckily, the gamble paid off. The first entry in the series, The Fellowship of the Ring, was released in December of 2001 and was an instant sensation. The movie went on to gross nearly $900 million worldwide, and it was nominated for 13 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. It won 4 of the Oscars it was nominated for, those being Best Cinematography, Best Makeup, Best Original Score, and Best Visual Effects. As the overall trilogy of Lord of the Rings movies has achieved legendary status over the years, The Fellowship of the Ring remains the place where it all started. Now that it has been over 20 years since the film was released, and the Lord of the Rings series has continued to expand with the likes of Prime Video's The Rings of Power, revisiting the first entry of Jackson's trilogy makes for a unique experience. How it adapts the book. The novel of The Fellowship of the Ring was first published in 1954 as the first volume of The Lord of the Rings, which Tolkien had written as a single complete unit. As a whole, Jackson's film adaptations of The Lord of the Rings make numerous changes from what was originally presented on the page, and that is certainly true of The Fellowship of the Ring. Tolkien was a writer who consistently brought great depth and detail to his work. Everything included in his works was a very deliberate creative choice. As a result, the Lord of the Rings books, The Fellowship of the Ring especially, are very dense reads. Much of the first half of The Fellowship of the Ring consists of long and winding descriptions of nature, the lore of Middle-earth, and the inner thoughts of characters. It's the kind of stuff that can be hard to accurately bring to the screen since it is so thoroughly intertwined with the medium of the written word. When adapting The Fellowship of the Ring to screen, there were changes that needed to be made. Much of the timeline of the story was condensed in order to make the events flow together more seamlessly. The biggest instance of this comes after Bilbo's birthday party in the opening act, when Frodo receives the ring and Gandalf frantically leaves to do his own research. While the film seems to imply that Gandalf wasn't gone for all that long, a few months, maybe a year at most, in the original story, 17 years passed between the wizard's departure and his return to confirm that Bilbo's ring was the One Ring. From there, Frodo and Samwise almost immediately pick up and leave the Shire to make for the village of Bree, while, in the novel, there were months of planning and prep that went into the departure of the hobbits. On top of the time compression of the film, Jackson's Fellowship of the Rings also admits several notable characters from the story, the most notorious of which is the jolly fellow Tom Bombadil, who saves Frodo, Sam, Pippin, and Merry from trouble in the Old Forest as they leave the Shire. There was also the elven hero Glorfindel, whose part in the original story was instead fulfilled by Arwen Undomiel in the film. The depiction of Sauron differed in the film as well, as the choice to show the series villain as a giant flaming eye atop Barad-dûr was made specifically for the film. These are only a few of the numerous book-to-screen changes that were seen in The Fellowship of the Ring. While some may be significant, what Jackson, Boyens, and Walsh did so brilliantly with the film was maintaining the core story and not altering the spirit of Tolkien's work. I'm going to say that again for those in the back who still may be clinging on to the Rings of Power as being somehow good, right? What Jackson, Boyens, and Walsh did so brilliantly with the film was maintaining the core story and not altering the spirit of Tolkien's work. There were certainly changes made to the material, but the overall experience and story of the Fellowship of the Ring remain almost entirely untouched. It's the perfect kind of adaptation that adjusts the story just enough to be most effective on screen while still staying true to what made the tale work to begin with. How it holds up. The early 2000s were an incredibly hit-and-miss time for blockbusters. Some films were extreme concentrations of all the worst trends of the time. Movies like 2003's Daredevil had a toxic mixture of poor CGI, action cliches, and an alt-rock soundtrack that have made them age about as poorly as imaginable. On the other hand, some of the most iconic blockbuster films of all time were released in the early 2000s. They had visual effects that were as stunning as they were pioneering, while the films were also telling sophisticated and considered stories that would resonate with audiences for years to come. Thankfully, The Fellowship of the Ring is the latter. That's not to say that there aren't any moments in The Fellowship of the Ring that show their age. Of course, there are a couple of small instances where it's clear that the film wasn't made with 2023 technology. Those issues are mostly just moments where the digital compositing is noticeable. However, overall, The Fellowship of the Ring holds up remarkably well. Many of the film's effects surpass those of even today's standards, whether it be the practical and digital methods that were used to implement the height differences between hobbits, dwarves, men, and elves, or more fantastical creations like the Balrog. The Fellowship of the Ring features some truly outstanding effects that are just as believable and immersive in 2023 as they were in 2001. As for the story, it's no surprise that The Fellowship of the Ring holds up in that regard, considering how faithful and respectful Jackson and the rest of the creative team were to the original work. Tolkien's work had already withstood the test of a half-century worth of aging when the movie was released, and it has continued to earn its high repute in the years since. The world that Tolkien created is one of the most imaginative and extensive in all of fiction, and Jackson's The Fellowship of the Ring truly brought that world to life on screen for the first time. While there had been other adaptations that preceded it, The Fellowship of the Ring was the first time that audiences were thoroughly transported into Middle-earth. It felt like a real place that the viewer could visit, and people wanted to be in Middle-earth so badly that New Zealand has received a never-ending and thriving tourism industry as a result. The context around it. The thing that has changed the most regarding The Fellowship of the Ring over the last 20 years is the context that surrounds it. The film is obviously just the first chapter in Jackson's The Lord of the Rings trilogy, but when the film was released, it was still up in the air whether the next two movies would maintain the same quality as the first. We now know that The Two Towers and The Return of the King are more than worthy follow-ups to The Fellowship, with many people arguing that either of those films could be the best of the trilogy, as it exists within the context of Jackson's overall trilogy. The Fellowship of the Ring is lifted to even higher heights. While it... Okay, yeah, I read that a little asinine. I'll do it again. As it exists within the context of Jackson's overall trilogy, The Fellowship of the Ring is lifted to even higher heights. While it can still be watched as a singular experience if you want, the film is so deeply tied into what comes next that it now almost exclusively exists as a portion of the whole. Most people these days view watching The Lord of the Rings as a complete experience that involves all three films together rather than as individual pieces. Excuse me. Beyond that, The Fellowship of the Ring was the first step in what would build The Lord of the Rings into a much larger film and television franchise. After the success of Jackson's trilogy, he would return to direct another Middle-earth trilogy of movies adapted from Tolkien's The Hobbit. While those films are almost universally considered to be nowhere near the quality of The Lord of the Rings, they were major financial successes that proved that the world of Middle-earth could successfully exist on screen beyond the core story of Frodo Baggins. Now the franchise is in the midst of even further expansion, as the Rings of Power is adapting the stories of the Second Age, thousands of years prior to The Lord of the Rings, into a streaming series on Prime Video. While that series has gotten off to a bumpy start, it was still a hit for the streamer and has plenty of promise for future seasons. There is also a new animated film in the franchise set to release next year. That film, The Lord of the Rings: War of the Rohirrim, will exist within the same continuity as Jackson's films. Revisiting The Fellowship of the Ring today, it's hard to watch the film without at least somewhat considering all the material that would follow as a result of its success, whether it be with the character of Bilbo and how the overall story now ties into Jackson's version of The Hobbit, or the further context of the film's prologue, which is now provided in The Rings of Power, even though that show is technically a different continuity. There has been so much more exploration of Middle-earth on screen in the years since the film was released. Viewers know a lot more about the world and lore of Middle-earth now than they did when The Fellowship of the Rings was released. A line such as Gandalf's reference to, quote, the incident with the dragon, unquote, in addition to the inclusion of characters like Elrond and Galadriel, carries more meaning to them than they once did. The Fellowship of the Ring is where the modern age of Middle-earth all started, and the movie remains one of the highest points in the series to date. All right. I can't disagree with that. Yeah, I mean, for those of us who read the books before the movies, the books are always where it will have started for us. But in terms of the whole idea of adaptations and bringing it to life on the screen, yes, I think Fellowship definitely sort of set the standard, right? And the stuff that came before it, like the animated adaptation of the 1970s Bakshi's version and stuff like that, I think they get a somewhat bad rap because they're compared to what Peter Jackson was able to pull off with The Fellowship of the Ring, Two Towers, and Return of the King. And then post those movies as well, I think, well, The Hobbit has some issues. I mean, let's be realistic here. The Hobbit has some issues. But I also think that The Hobbit was also doomed to always not be as good. And it would always not be as good because it would, to this day, it's still compared to the Lord of the Rings trilogy, right? And it's always going to come up a little bit short, right? It's just always going to do that. And let's not even start with Rings of Power, right? Rings of Power, that's a complete abomination, and we'll just keep that in a separate category of, garbage. But yeah, I mean, I think to this day, it is still, you're not going to find a sci-fi, well, I shouldn't say sci-fi, but you're not going to find a fantasy or high fantasy film or series of films or even TV series that are going to stack up well against the original Peter Jackson trilogy, specifically in this case referencing the Fellowship of the Ring. I just don't think you're going to for a long time. I don't think modern day Hollywood or directors And when I say modern day, I mean everything, say, post 1997, right? Um, I I think modern Hollywood and modern day directors, with the exception of a rare few like Peter Jackson, the Hollywood industry is not interested in adapting things in the best possible way. They are more concerned with adapting things in the most profitable way, right? And I think that's you know that's one of the core issues that you see with Rings of Power or Wheel of Time, or even when they Paramount did the Halo adaptation from the Halo game and they made the series. There's this fundamental need to change it um, to get it to comport with modern day sensibilities and modern day views, and that tends to take the priority these days over adapting a story in the best possible way. I like what he said about it's um one of the reasons for its success is that they were so focused on the work, right? On being true to the work and holding up the spirit of the work of what Tolkien had done, that came first, and that was the priority item for them. And you don't get that anymore. I think Lord of the Rings, ironically enough, is one of those the last few films where you saw a franchise that was trying to put out the best possible adaptation that still embodied the spirit of the original work and of the original author and writers and stuff like that. And I think it's one of the last films that has done that or even tried to do that, because even other films that have come out since then throughout the 2000s, the Ghostbusters 2016 sort of reboot, you had the Terminator Dark Fate, and you had all these sort of franchise, Star Wars, Star Trek, Doctor Who, all these sort of franchise tentpole movies or adaptations, or you know additions to existing franchises, and they were less concerned with continuing what made the originals so good and so likable and so popular, and more concerned with discarding that in favor of creating something that fits in with today's modern sensibilities, right? So take Terminator Dark Fate. It was less about trying to recapture the magic of the original Terminator or even Terminator 2, right? And what made those essentially classic films. And it became more about, well, we got to have a strong woman for this, we got to have a strong woman for that, we got to have this character be a girl, we need to kill off that guy character, and it became more a um it became more about embodying modern sensibilities, cultural sensibilities, than it became about embodying the spirit of what made the original so good. And I think Lord of the Rings is one of those last few films where the directors and the writers and everybody involved was 100% committed to the idea of keeping the spirit of what makes Tolkien's work so universally loved, right? And I think that's what it is. And I don't think we've seen much of that in a lot of things since then. Definitely not in Rings of Power. But yeah, let me know what you guys think down in the comments section below. I can go on and just rant and rave about it, but that's not why you're here. Let me know what you think down in the comments section below. What are your thoughts on the Fellowship of the Ring as we are now coming up on 22 years? In December will be 22 years since the Fellowship was released. What do you think? Do you think it's held up well? Do you think it still holds up well? And where do you think we've seen, you know, anything else that has really tried to capture the core and spirit of what it was adapted from? The way Peter Jackson and Walsh and Boyens did, where they put that as the leading concept as opposed to, modern sensibilities as a leading concept. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. I think it's interesting. Like I said, thinking back on it, it was definitely a watershed moment in terms of, understanding as a filmmaker what you could do if you were concerned, if you focused on what was important versus just, pumping something out for the masses, in order to get your return on investment, right? It for me, it was an abject lesson in, if you truly believe in what you're doing, i.e., in this case, adapting Tolkien's work to the screen, then it can be done, and it can be done right. If you're coming at it from a good place, it could be done right. If you're coming at it to check off boxes, if you're coming at it to just make a buck and stuff like that, that will show in your work, and it will come across in unconscious, subconscious sort of little ways that it will just make itself known, right? And I think the Lord of the Rings trilogy, in addition to sort of being like my sort of fantasy nerd wet dream of seeing it live on a live action adaptation, that was the thing that I took away from, as somebody who had an interest in doing films and visual effects and stuff like that. It was just like, you can do this if you're coming at it from the right perspective. If your motivations are good, you can do this. And that's what I took away from it. But let me know what you think down in the comment section below. As always, if you like the video, remember to like the video. If you feel like sharing the video, by all means, feel free to do so, because it helps us get seen. It helps spread the word. It helps the algorithm and the YouTube machine do its thing and helps promote us. Ideally, I'd like to get us up to, I'd like to break the 1,000 mark of subscribers this year, preferably before the summer. But it is what it is, and we'll every new person we get to join the army of beautiful badasses, is a win, right? That's one more fighter on the side of good. And speaking of which, if you have not subscribed already and are considering doing so, I would invite you to join us and join the fight for the professor and his works and high fantasy and escapism, and not having all of our artistic and imaginative outlets, dragged down to just be representatives of modern society, right? Let's defend, let's hold that line, right? Let's draw that line in the sand and hold it, and we won't give an inch. And if you're considering subscribing, join us, because the more the merrier, and we tend to have a good time. And if you are a returning subscriber, again, as always, thank you from the bottom of my heart. You are a beautiful badass. All right, that's all I got for today, folks. This will be the last video of today, and I will talk to you soon. Remember to be good, be awesome, be safe, but more importantly, stay more dorkish. Peace.